Welcome to The Learning Core, a podcast by Telos on the Telos channel. Together, we'll interrogate the core issues of conflict with experts from around the world and uncover the path forward toward creative action in our communities. My name is Sarah Sturm, and I'm your host. Today, we're discussing some of Telos's recent ReStory US work in the city of Charleston, South Carolina. Through our ReStory US programming, we're working together to repair America, one where all are able to flourish by knowing, owning, and writing a more honest American story. While our ReStorying work isn't only for Christian communities, the recent trip had a unique lens on the history of Christian complicity and resistance, and that comes through in our conversation. Whether you personally identify as Christian or not, this history is important for all of us to interrogate, and I think you'll still enjoy the conversation. I'm joined by Doctors DeSean Dyson and Otis Pickett, who co-led the trip. Dr. DeSean Dyson is Telos's own Director of U.S. Programming. Before he joined Telos, he served as Assistant Professor and Special Assistant to the President at Mississippi College, and as the founding head of school at the Redeemer School in Jackson, Mississippi. He has over 15 years of experience in education and leadership, dedicated to supporting communities that have been historically underserved and marginalized. Dr. Otis Pickett is a historian of religion in the U.S. South, focusing on domestic missions to enslaved African American missionaries and the intersection of race, religion, and ecclesiastical polity in Southern Presbyterianism. He's interested in the ways that church polity and governance was applied to whites, African Americans, and Native Americans differently based on race, civil status, and property ownership. Dr. Pickett also serves as the university historian at Clemson University. As you'll hear throughout our conversation, the two are also longtime friends and model so well what it looks like to do this work in community for the long haul. Forgive my informality as I refer to them as Otis and DeSean. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome, Otis and DeSean. I'm so excited to have you both as guests today to talk a little bit more about the recent ReStory trip you both led in Charleston. DeSean, let's just jump right in. I'd love to have you share a little bit more about what that weekend experience was. What was it? Why'd y'all go somewhere new for ReStory, and what did you do?
Yes, so I'll start by referencing an investigative journalism piece that I was recently introduced to, done by the Center of Public Integrity, about 40 Acres and a Lie. And it reflects on the program that many are familiar with, 40 Acres and a Mule, and land and the relationship of dispossession. And it actually starts the storytelling and the journalism work in South Carolina. And I won't say too much because I really encourage listeners to check that out. But one of the things that's really powerful is you can tell there is so much unresolved. I won't even call it tension, it's just brokenness that exists among the many actors that are involved in our shared collective stories. And so I think what a journey, an experience to a place like Charleston that houses so many of these stories where you can see the intersections of people's faith and of the land and of the Middle Passage and of an economy that's swollen from a system of exploitation and all these things, that it is a unique place to experience sort of all of these places and things converging. And we have the unique, just sort of benefit of Dr. Pickett, Otis, who has scholarship that really taps into some of the elements that makes some of the takeaways really transfer to some things that we're thinking through today as it relates to societal structures and power and takeaways and what do we do now. And so that's what we're doing, is going to explore sort of some of these complex systems for the sake of how do we take away from history in ways that men like contemporary brokenness now?
That's such an important question, DeSean. How do we use the past to help us better understand the present and then go that next step further, even of saying, how do we build a future that looks different from the past? Otis, this is the first time that you've helped co lead a Telos trip, and you're from South Carolina. I know you were born in Charleston, not still living there. But what about Charleston or South Carolina is something unique that adds something really deep to this story and this kind of bigger work?
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here and with my good friend DeSean Dyson. And this is my first time leading a ReStory trip, but I've been involved in a lot of the ReStory trips to Mississippi. And I was just telling folks at Telos, you got to go to Charleston. You got to go to Charleston. You got to go to Charleston. And one, Charlestonians think the world sort of centers around the Ashley and the Cooper River, right? Like that's where the Ashley and the Cooper River, that's where they collide to create the Atlantic Ocean, according to Charleston, the Charlestonian worldview. But really, when you're talking about the beginnings of these systems, the beginnings of laws that are created, the beginnings of importation, the beginnings of how the institution of slavery moves west, there's 100 years that's in Charleston from 1670 to the American Revolution, where all that's being created. And so the way I framed it was, you visited Louisiana, you visited, Mississippi and Alabama. A lot of those experiences happen in a space in Charleston that are then picked up and moved to Western South Carolina, into Georgia, out to Alabama and Mississippi. The genesis of this whole system, in my mind, begins in an Atlantic world context, a Barbadian, Western African, Caribbean context, and then North America. Charleston is one of the first cities where that's created and codified, and those systems are put into place. And so I wanted folks to see those spaces. I also wanted them to see how Christians engage in this world across 4 centuries. And so, for instance, in 2015, after the Mother Emanuel shooting, most Americans witnessed some things in Charleston that they went, Charleston's a little bit different than other spaces that we've seen these events happen, in terms of how the community was coming together. And so my research tries to figure out, one, what was the Christian role of the institution of slavery? How did Christians go about supporting segregation? But also, how did Christians across racial lines also come together at certain moments in American history? And Charleston provides us with a few of those moments. So that was the reason. And I also just love going to see my family and friends and eating good Charleston food. So
The food always makes it so great to go and study some pretty heavy history.
Oh yeah. It makes it a lot easier. Mary Poppins was right.
Oh yeah, spoonful of sugar.
Spoonful of sugar. Yeah, that's right.
Well, there are so many things you're bringing up that I think are really important themes, both for Charleston, and also, I don't know a lot of the specific history. I would have loved to have been on this trip with y'all, but that I think translate both historically and in the present moment. And I just want to reaffirm what you just said around historically and through today. Religious actors, ordinary Christians, have been both forces for harm, but also forces for justice, peace, reparations, healing. And I think there's an invitation in that, right, to choose to own that as part of our story, as well as owning the harm, to pick up on that legacy for today.
Yes, absolutely. I also want to mention too, DeSean and I we've led these trips to Charleston before with other organizations before DeSean came to Telos. And DeSean, I don't know if you want to talk about that some, but when I was writing this work, I always had the Christian church in the back of my mind. And what I saw was how Christians of goodwill who wanted to acknowledge humanity, who wanted to acknowledge the dignity of the enslaved, were hemmed in on every side by economic structures, political systems, white supremacy, racism. Every turn, they're hemmed in. And ultimately, they give in because they're choosing their own safety. They're choosing their family's security. They're choosing their ability to be employed over what would have been, I think, what Jesus calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so my hope is that an embedded lesson in this work is like, okay, what are the systems today that are keeping Christians from loving our neighbor fully? And that there have been all these moments in American history for us to learn from. And I try to paint a picture of hope and courage to say, what would it have been like had these Christians in Charleston in 1860 had affirmed human dignity and affirmed human life and affirmed civic equality? What a story that would have been. What a dynamic change that would have been in American history had they just made that decision. Now, that's asking a lot because it would have asked them to die or to be beaten or to be arrested. But anyway, it's something for us to consider. And then we see that again in the civil rights movement. So D, I don't want to hog too much of your.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons that Otis and I often, as we do this work together, we're best friends. Our work sort of runs adjacent and parallel in so many ways, but we also have different questions. And so for me to be, a person of color who's inherited a faith that has gone through these experiences, what does it look like for me to search out the history of my ancestors through the oppressive, even though at times there were efforts to find dignity. And it's one of those things that you can't really bestow it upon, I believe, my people who were given it at, their, inception, is something that we own, that we possess inherently. So you have to sort of have these multiple framings of one, a system that's struggling with itself that Otis talks about, that's making moves in a broader society about, okay, we have codified, racist, dehumanizing, evil, oppressive systems. But you have also an enslaved people, the capacity to develop an inherited spiritual practices and spiritual identity and spiritual resilience that can let them meet that moment to where they don't have to be, taught Christianity necessarily by white oppressors. Like, it's something that they've possessed for generations, this sense of connection with the spiritual. And so for me to occupy that same space and to find little huts where enslaved people engaged in worship, to travel to, whether it be a Mother Emanuel, where even recently has been victim to atrocious terrorist acts of violence, and they meet you with worship and joy and celebration. Like, that is a tradition of faith that you reconcile those two. Like, how do you find the intersection of the story isn't just the structure and how it is limited and tried to strip humanity and dignity from people, but it's a story of resilience. It's a story of, I'll talk about this more later, resistance to something that's happening. And so I think that's part of what complex history does. Every time you think you're understanding what's happening, one more perspective makes it harder to say that you understand it fully. And so that's one of the things that we had the privilege of, so many diverse scholars and so many diverse perspectives, is every stop someone has something to add. Like, maybe 5 points were brought up, but it was the sixth person who had this aspect or element of that space that had a contribution that brought something to it that really fleshed out an element of it. And I think that's part of what I know historically Otis and I have always done is, I always say this to be people of color and to have held on to a faith that has been weaponized against your body, your spirit, and your soul, and to hold on to that as something that is like good and beautiful is an amazing work of God, but it's also like intellectually very nimble to have been able to like hear some of the things that Otis teaches about and talks about and to make sense of it. And so going to some of these complex hubs allows you the space to really work through some of those complex stories.
This is so rich, and it's really, I think, highlighting to me so many of Telos's principles and practices of peacemaking too. DeSean, what you just described really lays out what it means to listen to understand different perspectives and histories, to hold them in tension with one another, not to seek which one is right, which one's wrong, right? But to say, what does this voice add? What does this perspective add? Because it's only through doing that we see the full complexity, both of the weight and the violence, but then also of that joy and resistance and resilience. And Otis, as you were describing some of the work you do, the practice that came up for me is what we call self-interrogation, looking at the ways that communities potentially have been complicit, where they've wittingly or unwittingly done harm and been a part of that violence and have an opportunity to change, right? Or own that history and try and move forward in a different direction. And then DeSean, what you offered in response, I think really highlights some of those other practices of owning your agency or looking for where people have owned their agency, even in the midst of oppressive structures and cultures of violence, right? People are resilient. There's been such a tradition of creativity and resistance that I'm excited to hear you talk more about, but how that also dovetails, right, with which stories we choose to center around people who've been historically marginalized and the different learnings that come from that. So I just think what you two are describing so clearly exemplifies this deeper work of what Telos calls peacemaking, which we sometimes describe as the courageous and countercultural way of life. And what I'm hearing come through from both of you too, right, is that to do this work historically today, it's not without cost. It can be dangerous. It asks people to take risks and potentially sacrifice their comfort for the sake of greater liberation, not just for themselves, but for their neighbors. So I just want to reaffirm how lucky I think we are to hear you two talk publicly about this deeper ongoing life work that you two have engaged in and are inviting us into as well.
Yeah, Sarah, I think that's right on. One thing I just want to remind the audience is that history is watching. Okay. So the next 3 centuries, people will be going through podcasts like this, our Twitter accounts, our Facebook feeds, our emails, and the pastors I came across, I'm looking at their communicants roll books from the 1850s as this man meticulously writes down the names of the enslaved, never probably thinking this would ever become published, right? And so the little things that we do have big meanings in history. I just want to encourage everyone, give people courage and hope that, your life is important. You have a role as a citizen in this country, and that your actions will speak very loud and echo across the centuries. I also just want to say Charleston is a really, they say all politics is local. I think all history is local, that we can look at national trends in history and international trends and hammer down to the local and see how those trends affect a local people. And so what's really fascinating for me as a Charlestonian, I don't know if you've read the recent book that Wright Thompson wrote called The Barn, where he talks about growing up in the Mississippi Delta, just a few miles from where Emmett Till was murdered. And this history was sort of covered for him as a child. And even as an adult, he didn't learn about this until adulthood. And so for me, growing up in Charleston, I did not know that my hometown of Sullivan's Island was a place that was a quarantining station for enslaved people, because there was no mention of it in textbooks or classes, or even any mention of it on the island itself. And so I go to Clemson and go to graduate school and learn all this stuff about my home. And I am just, I can't believe it. And so then all these questions for me come out about why was there this intentional hiding? Why was there this intentional effort to cover over with a veneer of respectability this horrific atrocity that was happening? Okay. So not only do I get to know the history, I have the lived experience of being sort of a participant in that system. And then I've also seen over the last 30, 40 years how my African-American friends and colleagues and mentors have been pushing for the African-American experience to be taught in Charleston. And I'm now seeing the transition from being a child and it being covered over to things like the International African-American Museum, and the painstaking decades it took to get that thing up, and getting the city to formally apologize for slavery in 2017, getting the city to put a marker at Adger's Wharf in 2016, acknowledging this is where the sale of human beings occurred, right next to the old Exchange building, which is where they signed the Constitution, And so for me, I loved history and became passionate about history, walking around, seeing it, putting my hands on it, engaging in it. I'm a tactile learner. I'm a hands-on learner. I'm a visual learner. And so these kinds of trips give people those opportunities. And then it gives people space, like DeSean would have a room for us at the hotel where we could process and talk once we saw those spaces. And so I think these trips help us accomplish Telos's mission.
So I want to go back to a few things you said, Sarah, and I'll start way back with the idea that, there are goals and aims for what we do. And, you have the principles and practice, but there are takeaways that we desire for people that go on these trips. The idea that you have space to self-interrogate and reflect is important, that we build your capacity for relational healing. Like, that is a desire. This experiential learning is a big deal. But one of the things that I think is really important, and when you said this, I think you caught the inflection in my voice that I want to talk about this more: resistance, like effective advocacy. And what does that mean? And so, one of the things that I was really struck by, and I think we are constantly in times, yet we are uniquely in times where you're asking yourself, what are you doing? And I know Otis, as a historian, made this point to me years ago about, the way that historians work is, you think of things like emails and social media posts, and you used the word earlier, courage, which, how do we frame what do you have at your disposal to be an agent of resistance to what's happening? And I think that that is one of the things that we were able to explore, is this complicated, we're able to explore this complicated phenomenon of courage, and the complexity that even we as a people have a hard time sometimes when we recognize it, how we recognize it, wanting to recognize it, when is sometimes speaking to a historical reality, is sometimes speaking to the desire we have that we would have been something in the moment. And so, one of the biggest takeaways for me, I was constantly asking Otis about this one particular figure, Denmark Vesey, and about this sort of ripple and this historic phenomenon of enslaved people revolting against the system. And so what you have is a reality of people who refuse to be subjugated and refuse to be constrained by those times, and you have a real backlash from the structures that be. And so when Otis talks about, how speaking up may cost you anything from your life to your social status, it may cost you your friends or your job. Those are real backlashes that come from pushing against oppression. The other side of that is if you don't push back, then it persists. And so the question that I find myself asking constantly is, okay, if we're sometimes maybe we exaggerate or we create resistance narratives where maybe they aren't actually there because they give us hope or they inspire us. But I think the takeaway for us from a Telos experience should be, okay, let's really reflect and be strategic. What does it mean today to resist and to use your agency, to use your location, to use your skills to be an agent of change, to be an agent of strategic action in whatever space you occupy? And I think that you hold that with the reality of what Otis mentioned earlier, that we understand that it comes with a cost. And that's the thing I think history may be a little sobering is when you take these trips, sometimes I think I've always been weird about, social media and some of these things because it's hard to gauge and monitor like what's impactful and what's making a difference. And it's helpful to hear from a historian that you often don't realize the outcomes of the work being put in for generations. And so, you know, the this morning before this call, Sarah's been working for hours probably at really, really difficult, hard stuff happening around us. And it's stuff that, people don't see. It's things that, we're not, and you'll see it and it won't be like tagged with her name and identified with it. And it may be, decades in the future where someone's influenced or impacted by like that strategic advocacy or action that you're taking. That was one of my takeaways is one, we so as a people believe in our capacity to create change, but there's a historical fear of what will it cost us. And I think we're still figuring out like, I'll stop after I say this. I'm reading being noticed for saying before the call that we have to work on our habits because I think we both wake up and the first thing we do is consume like news. And so like I'm just ramped up. I'm in the group chat and I'm like, how about this? Like sitting and like just stuff that I think we should know about and it should be on our minds and you should not be going through your day not knowing that people are like we're literally talking about displacing people from their land like flippantly to develop it like just simple business transactions. Like we should be hurting, like it should be hurting our hearts to hear these conversations happening. But then there are other times where I'm reading like Bonhoeffer and hearing him talk about like these more reflective ways of viewing how much God longs for and desires justice in the world. And so it takes away like a fear of mine that I'm being like moved and swayed from like the moment. And like, no, I'm actually being tethered to eternity, that God loves justice. God is eternally compelled to move towards those who are hurting.
And he loves it when his people love other people who are hurting.
Absolutely.
He delights in his children loving others hurting, right?
Absolutely.
Amen.
And so, like, instead of me, like, as a framing mechanism, starting with anger, which I think righteous anger is a thing, right? I think that there are times that we should be compelled, like, that I woke up this morning upset, I don't think is a bad thing. Like, I think that that was fed by something that was from a good place, but it's anchored in what I think is a design that I love my neighbor. And gosh, I wish I could give credit to who Delta Epiphany. Oh, this who am I talking about?
Oh, yeah.
In Oxford, posted something about like that neighbor is not a geographical term. Like it's a concept
Yeah.
about, like how we operate and how we live. And so I tie that to, my kind of last push and pitch for like, no, we need to be advocates and activists in the sense that we are actively pursuing the peace and justice of God and doing that with wisdom and doing that strategically, but also not necessarily expecting that the results are going to be today, tomorrow results, that it gets complicated. Some of us are called to work where it can be a policy thing that we can advocate and that can happen with a quicker turnaround. Some of us is going to be, you know, Otis Pickett the sixth studying and reading about you and saying, you know what? I've been looking at what Sarah was doing then. And even when others were not caring about this issue, she would not let us rest on our morals. She was really, really concerned with the people and their plight. And so I think to go back to what can we do with this information, not just the experience, but what can you do with it?
I think my invitation for folks listening, right, is start small. Building courage takes time. And I think advocacy, like anything else, is a muscle that the more we exercise it, gets stronger and more natural. So talking to a family member about something you care about or are passionate about, not in a way that debates, but invites them to think more critically or think about a different perspective, that's advocacy. We invite you all to call your Congress people a lot. That's advocacy. But talking to your pastor, right, about bringing in some of this or hosting a book discussion or bringing in a peacemaking training, all of that's also advocacy. And I think for so many people, there's a barrier when we look at these heroes of history, right, who are the giants whose shoulders we stand on, and we feel like we will never measure up to them. But it's not an all or nothing proposition, right? There are so many small ways that we can exercise that courage and own our agency and advocate in ways that build slowly over time. And DeSean, like you said, right, this work will continue long after all of us are gone. And our hope is to move it forward, but not give up when we feel like it's overwhelming. And I think, especially in moments like these, I was rage typing social media posts this morning, right? I've gotten to channel a lot of my energy and advocacy through Telos, but even if you don't have a Telos or something like that, right, there are different ways that you can bring what you're passionate about, principles you believe in, peacemaking and justice commitments to your communities in ways that don't just have to be the kind of flashy, historical, big moment advocacy.
Let me say this too. I got a couple ideas here. Number one, that idea that we want to be that figure in history, right? And that we can never measure up. And I think of like DeSean mentioned Bonhoeffer. We should all be reading our Bonhoeffer and the Charles Marsh interpretation of Bonhoeffer, not some of the other stuff that's out there. But like Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy, who are assassinated, right? Now, you may not be that Martin Luther King, but you may be someone who in your community advocates for a perspective, someone like Martin Luther King. And then maybe that person doesn't get assassinated. Another thing I would encourage people to is that social media is a tool. It is not the advocacy. It's a tool. And so what you need to do is, if you keep getting on social media to be your primary space where you advocate, you're going to get frustrated and angry. If you get involved in your community and you know your neighbors and you meet people and talk to them and figure out as a team what your community response can be, then you're not alone. You're together. And then you can use social media as a tool to organize. But I think some folks lack that, they don't have that connecting point. And so they see their advocacy as this when it really should be comprehensive. The other thing I wanted to say, Dee, was, with Denmark VC, where we're going to now is Denmark VC did not even have an opportunity to resist, right? It was just whispered that he wanted to resist. Whether or not he had ever intentionally planned a slave insurrection, historians still debate. But we are at a place now where if it is whispered that you resist, you can be dealt with. And so Denmark VC was what upset people about Denmark VC is that his sheer existence as a free Black man in Charleston, making his own autonomous decisions, was so offensive to the white population, they had to deal with him and get rid of him. And that insurrection might have been planned. In fact, we do see some evidence that he was planning something. But even if it wasn't, it could have been created by the community to evoke fear to murder him and his colleagues. And so that is a great example. It's a really great example of just your life, the friendships you have, the circles you run in, the autonomous decisions you make could be resistance. And that could even be dealt with. And you don't even have to be a Bonhoeffer. But what's so sad to me is that as a society, we've said, we're not going to value history. It's all STEM. There's no job at the end of it. Let's not fund history departments. Let's make higher ed essentially a place where you go and get a degree so you can labor and work, right? A plus B equals C. This degree plus this knowledge equals C, this job. And so as being in someone in higher ed for 20 years, I have seen nothing but a complete devaluing of the humanities. And so I'm not surprised that we're in this moment. And I'm not surprised that Americans have no category for it because they don't know history. It's not a question to me of the value of history. It's a question of we don't care, and we've not cared for decades.
I think that's an invitation to everyone in our network or everyone listening to this to also own your agency to seek out that information yourself. You don't have to be a professional historian, although we need more good ones, right? You don't have to be a professional peacemaker. In whatever job, vocation, life chapter you're in, seeking out people, partners, voices, resources, books that help contextualize or help give depth to some of what we talk about, whether there are partners on the ground or resources, books we recommend. That's a really great way to take ownership over your own learning and your own journey, right? And not wait until culturally we're at a place where this is easily accessible. That's not the only way to resist, but knowledge is power. And part of knowing how to resist, or part of, I think, fueling the long-term enduring kind of commitment to peace and justice, is knowing deeper trends, reading stories of people who've done incredible things in small ways and large ways. And as we transition into the latter kind of quarter of our conversation, I'm wondering if there's so much more we could talk about, but if one of the ways we can use our time together is to maybe hear some of those stories from Charleston that a lot of us won't know, either about resistance or resilience, DeSean, as you were saying. Let's start with each of you picking one, maybe two, and then we'll see how much time we have. But I'm wondering if you can bring us some of those stories that we can then go investigate further on our own.
Yeah, so I'll, I guess, reframe, if I have permission, the
Please.
question, because you said something earlier that, and it's often a question I get, which is, I can recall being told by a, counselor friend, this is a direct opposition to what Otis just said, but you have to, like, context is king. Like, all I read are like history books and like these deep theology books. And I had a counselor friend be like, "You got to chill out. Go pick up Harry Potter." And so, like, if I was at my regular desk, like, you would
That's
see
healthy.
it. Well, and that's something I had to be taught. That, like, if you look at my desk, I've got like Harry and Ron and Hermione, and I've got my Ravenclaw teacup that Otis gave me. But there's this idea that, like, from my youth, I've just been surrounded by this. Like, my parents, my grandparents, like, living in this city, living in this place. And I've just kind of had this tick that if I'm going to do this work, I've got to do this work the way that the people I read about do this work. And to your point earlier, Sarah, that's not true. And so, as a corrective measure, like, you can find space of what does it look like for you. And so, the pivot I'll make is one of the most amazing things that I saw was the creativity of the people who we tend to define by their enslavement.
Mm.
And I just want this to be an encouragement and exhortation for the imagination that we all possess. That we may feel stuck in this moment, we may feel stuck when looking at a problem, but literally every time I walked past, I learned this in this trip, I didn't realize this, that they particularly, and I won't give away the whole thing because I want to encourage people to come and experience some of this. But there were particular skills that enslaved people were taken from Africa because the white South Carolinians were unable to do things. So they were on the land and they realized, like, for all that we have here, we can't do a lot of the stuff that we need to do for this place to flourish. And so when they went, it wasn't like they just said, "Hey, the first person you see, grab them." They went to communities with people that had skills and creative imaginations, and they said, "We're going to exploit your labor and bring you here." And so it gave me new eyes when I saw that community, that I would see, like, craftsmanship, or I would see, like, just all over the city. When I look now, I see a community in the same way, going back to my original point about, 40 acres and a lie, of, like, promises unfulfilled. And I think the same is true for us now, that we'll get stuck in thinking about the things that we aren't. And we are filled with so much imagination. If we will, like, devote ourselves in some and when I say devote, like, that's not devote in the sense of, like, making the sacrifices some of these people that we've talked about have made, but it's putting some intellectual bandwidth, it's putting some of your creative bandwidth behind what did it look like for me to make a meaningful contribution. And so that was a big deal for me, that when I go to Charleston, if you ever go with me, this is sort of like an Easter egg for people. You'll notice me always looking at certain things about the city. And so, like, we may have a speaker, but I'll be staring at, like, a part of a building, or we'll be at a restaurant and I'll be staring at this. Or there'll be certain aspects of, like, clothing or different things. And it just makes me smile because I was like, I want to hit the table. Like, you can't suppress that. Like, you can't, as hard as you try to, like, bring us over here and to reduce us to this, like, this instrument, this tool, you could not suppress all that was embodied in, whether it be spiritual, whether it be creativity, imagination. And so that's one of my takeaways in terms of, like, that's resistance. Like, that's something that it is no surprise to me that people out here banning books. Like, that kind of creativity and brilliance is terrifying to people who don't want people to use imagination that has from the very beginning been scary and dangerous because of what it means to a society that wants you to just fit into a locked system of suppression and oppression.
Mm.
I love you, D. That's so good, man.
I really want to come to Charleston with both of you. This just sounds, I already
D
did. And
just,
now I just want
he
to
is
spend
so
the weekend
good.
with both of you in person.
Sarah, is this guy not, he's just the best.
No, we are so lucky that DeSean is lending his creativity and imagination to our Telos team right now. Yeah.
I want to mention a couple things. One is, as you're going to look at how Christians have had that imagination and resistance, I want to encourage people to study the African American Christian experience in this country. So look at Albert Rabbitoe's Slave Religion. Look at John Giggie's work, After Redemption. Look at Charles Marsh's work, God's Long Summer. Look at how African American Christians were enslaved for generations, resisted that creatively, pushed back creatively, persisted, found joy. So the imagination that DeSean is speaking about is just born in centuries of suffering. And so like white Christians have no imagination because we've not suffered. We've not been through that. We've always been in a position of power. And the one little moment where that power is challenged just a little bit, they freak out. And they try to get their power back through politics. And so this beautiful imagination that DeSean is talking about is all over Charleston. It is in Philip Simmons' ironwork. It is in the sweetgrass basket making tradition. It is in the culinary expression. Everything about Charleston is woven together and permeated by African and American and African intelligence. And that's what makes the city so beautiful. But this is not an ancient problem. So what is happening now is that Gullah Geechee communities that have existed on land for centuries are being pushed out by developers because everyone in the world wants to live in Charleston. And then when I was a child, Calhoun Street, everything north of Calhoun Street, Black-owned businesses, Black-owned neighborhoods, Black experiences, and most of things south of Calhoun was white. But we were across the street from one another. All right. Now, what's happened now is since Charleston is a #1 destination city on the planet by many magazines, people who rate these cities, it's like a #1 city on the planet. All these people want to live there. And so they're pushing out Black folks daily. And what you're going to have in 50 years is a city with no imagination. It's going to be homogenous. It's going to be a miserable place to visit because it's just going to be, oh, this is like other urban renewal cities in the South that have no culture and no uniqueness to it. Oh, here's where I can go get my Chipotle, and here's where I can go get my Starbucks, and here's where, it's like, what? And so it's not a question of this stuff being done in the past. It's being done in the present. I'm going to give an example of a community that I visited yesterday. This is fresh on my mind. I could talk about Charleston all day, but I want to talk about this little community because it's connected to Charleston. There's a little place in South Carolina called Liberia, and it's up in the mountains. It's almost right next to the North Carolina border. And it's the home to about 700 enslaved people who, after enslaved people were given their freedom, they brought all these enslaved people up from the coast and dumped them in the worst possible land for any kind of cultivation, worthless land. Okay. And these people, they're literally digging stones the size of this office out of the ground so they can cultivate cotton and cultivate an existence. And I met with a woman yesterday, Mabel Clark, who in the 1950s, the KKK in the area decided they wanted her home and they wanted her farm. And she's hiding under the bed as her fathers and her brothers are shooting at the KKK coming at their home. And then the KKK burns down their church, Soapstone Church, in 1967. And that community rebuilds that church in 1968. Well, then their land that's owned by a bank in the 1990s, all of a sudden everyone wants to move to the mountains, right? And so all these developers come in because they've got these amazing views of the mountains. And these developers come in and say, oh, you've got this note, and they're trying to take the land from her again. That was worthless 200 years ago. Okay. And so she makes this story known. It goes out in all these magazines, and there's a GoFundMe, and they raise the money to keep the land, and they're still there. And it's got one of the most amazing slave graveyards in the state. It's got this historic church, and it's this one woman whose ancestors just fought, and she's still fighting. She's still fighting, and she still needs support and love. Visit, learn about Soapstone Church, learn about Mabel Davis Clark and her work, and support it. And there's a white man who's helped her get a land conservation easement where this church can always be protected. But people have been trying to take for centuries, and they're continuing to do it. It's not new.
I think that invitation, Otis, to look for those folks, right, who need our support and solidarity, and those stories of violence and resilience, whether it's in Charleston and Selma, in our own communities, wherever we live in the U.S. These aren't stories and histories unique to the South. I think part of the invitation, right, obviously, is to come and travel with DeSean and Otis and learn from their wisdom, come and see these communities that have this depth of history and resiliency, but also look for where that's happening in your own backyard. Part of the work of ReStorying is doing it nationally as an entire community. And all of us and all of our communities are complicit both in the violence, but then also have those deep pockets of a history of resiliency and resistance. And it's our job to tap into those both where we are and then also connect them to the bigger picture.
Sarah, can I show this real quick?
Please do.
So this is the book. It's called Liberia, South Carolina by John Coggeshall, and it's UNC Press.
I'll make sure I link it in the show notes.
It's an excellent book that interviews Mabel Clark. This is a real place. It's a real hit. There's been histories written about it. I was there yesterday. Anyway, I don't want people to think, oh, what it's there.
Absolutely. Well, Otis and DeSean, I could listen to you forever, but our time together is over for today. And I just want to thank you both so much for taking the time in what is a very busy context right now, doing the great work that you both do separately and together, to invite us to not just learn more about these stories, but also to think about the agency we want to own and find our place in them. And for our listeners, I want to invite you to keep owning your creativity, your imagination, and to find community both through Telos, but also locally. That, when we look at history, is also so essential to sustaining any kind of peace and justice resistance movement.
Sarah, can I just say thank you? And DeSean, can I say thank you? And can I give a shameless plug for my book and my podcast?
Please do.
All right. So my book comes out in October 23rd. It's called Southern Shepherds, Savage Wolves, Presbyterian Missionaries and Race in South Carolina, 1802 to 1874. And I want to thank my university, Clemson University, that has made a gift to make sure this is open access, that anyone can download it for free. And I want folks to engage with this work, read it, tell me what you think. But I'd love for it to be something that churches can read as a tool, or anyone can read as a tool. And it's focused on Charleston, South Carolina, but these themes are present everywhere. And I also have a podcast called Purpose That Prevails, that we engage these questions of race in the church, and also what can essentially folks do to partner with people in local communities. So we talk about these things. And so I just wanted to, if that's okay, do a shameless plug for what I'm doing.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone should go check out your book and the podcast, and I'll make sure they're linked so folks can find them easily.
Now, the book doesn't come out till October, so you ain't going to find it till October 23rd.
We'll make a nice calendar note, something to look forward to.
But anyway, and I just want to say, DeSean Dyson is one of the finest human beings on this planet that is walking around this planet right now, and is one of the most absolutely incredibly, amazingly talented individuals I've ever worked with that gets things on so many different layers. It's unbelievable. And it constantly blows me away. And so I just want to shout out to D and his work. And D, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this work you're doing with Telos, brother. It's incredible.
Too kind. Love you, man.
Well, DeSean and Otis, thank you so much. And to all of our listeners, we'll see you next time.